Good afternoon. My name's Hami Vanderwert, and most of you know that, and I'm a member of this church, and I'm a member of the Christian Ed Committee here. As Methodists, we're called to acts of social justice, mercy, and charity. This has been the case since John Wesley started the Methodist movement in, does anybody know the date?
Several ministers here.
1738. Today we are fortunate to have two members of the Tompkins County's League of Women Voters to come speak to us about the history of voting rights, what is happening in our towns, county, and country at the present time. The League was founded just over 100 years ago during the time of the suffrage movement in this country. Think about that. Our country was over 100 years old and women still not have the right to vote. Our speakers today are Susan Moulter, who joined the League in 1970. She has been a member in New Jersey, helped form a chapter in Steuben County when she lived there, and is now part of the Tompkins League. Susan currently is co-chair of the Natural Resource Committee and sits on the State League Committee on Criminal Justice. Sally Grubb has been a member for 10 years and is currently co-president. She comes to the League after serving on the Ithaca School Board and experiencing the League's work running candidate forums. The nonpartisan policy of the League really appeals to her. Please help me welcome our speakers.
County. We were one of the first leagues to be formed immediately after women got the vote, and when the National League was formed, we formed out of a group called where is it?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
It doesn't matter. We had a group here in town, and I should say in the county. I apologize for using the term Ithaca to mean the county. It's a habit all of us who don't live in Dryden or Trumansburg or Newfield fall into. But when I say Ithaca, I mean Dryden as well. We had a group of women who ran a political group and were very concerned both with the suffrage movement but also women's rights and the importance of the safety of women in working in Ithaca. If there were single women who were living in Ithaca, they developed what was then called, and some of you will remember, the Women's Community Building. In its original format, single women lived there, and it was a safe space where women could live, and single working women had a space of their own. And it developed a group of different women organizations worked together and eventually became the community, now I'm showing my age. Anyway, the Women's Community Building was a group of different organizations, and eventually they sold the building and set up a foundation. And they now, every year they send out grants to different people, groups, working with women and children. And they have one grant a year of up to 10,000 for a new project, otherwise small grants. If, for instance, here you needed funds to run a creche for mothers and babies and you didn't have the financial support for it, you could apply for a grant and you'd have a good chance of getting it. That was the foundation of the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters has done an enormous amount in our community. We were involved in preventing the Milliken Power Station from being a nuclear power station. We were involved in a lot of the reorganization of the schools. when the Ithaca City School District was formed out of the multiple surrounding schools and became one unified district. The League of Women Voters did an enormous amount of work to recruit viable candidates for school board and to help developing the policies that set up the administration. They worked county town planning and different things like that. As well as that, and you heard the introduction about Susan's affiliation with environmental groups. The League, locally here and nationally, works on different issues and works to come up with a consensus viewpoint. And for instance, we are involved now in trying to control cryptocurrency mining in New York State. Not because there's anything wrong with cryptocurrencies, but the incredibly heavy use of power is what we're opposed to. We have a small group that's setting up to discussing digital equity, as we know in communities around here. Just from your geography, somebody may not have access to Wi-Fi.
Right.
And that is, this group is working towards making people look at Wi-Fi the same way they looked at telephones. Everybody has access to a telephone. Not because they're rich, not because they live in the right place, but because everybody needs a telephone. The aim is the same for Wi-Fi access. We're working on healthcare for all. That's another issue where the League is working towards healthcare for all and has a policy that we will advocate for. Elsewhere, we are non-partisan. You will hear Susan and I out in the community speaking on behalf of the League when our local league has approved that. But if we're not approved, when I go out and talk, say to my church, I wear my personal hat and I can't go out and say I'm representing the League of Women Voters. And it's a fine balancing act. Today we were invited to come and talk about voting rights and where voting rights are in Ithaca. And if you're registering people to vote, it's amazing how many people do not have access to the vote here in our community because they're homeless, because they have mental problems, they're drug addicted, and they don't know how. And it's very difficult for a group like us to go out and find those people. If I walk down into the jungle, people don't trust me. I look too clean, I look too nice. So one of the things that the League does, and we are doing through a coalition of groups locally, is trying to reach out more and more to the disadvantaged, the disenfranchised, to get them registered, understanding how to vote, but also understanding why they vote. You'd be surprised how many people you meet on the streets will say, I'm not bothering to vote, what's the point? One vote doesn't count. Nobody listens to me anyway. So our big push now, and it should be for all of us, regardless of our political affiliation, is to get people to understand that for the safety of our democracy, we should all be involved, and we should all learn how to vote, why to vote, and then to vote what we think. I shouldn't represent you at the voting booth. I should represent me. So here's to Susan.
I want to start by thanking you for the privilege and the honor to speak with you today. Why do I say that? Because you have a history in Dryden and the surrounding area of doing something dramatic and awesome between 2009 and 2014. And that was to take a stand against fracking. And if anybody doesn't know what fracking means, that's the nickname for the process of using high volume, high pressure hydraulic fracturing of shale by drilling down a mile or more, turning and drilling through the shale, blasting the shale open and letting the gas come out. The process of preparing for that, doing that, and the after effects create air pollution, water pollution, and negative impact on our health and that of the planet. It took you all time and energy and money to research the problem, to educate yourselves and others, to not give up, even when, after you got a zoning change made in your town and then someone from the industry sued you, you didn't give up. And you won. And I heard about this because I was living on the southern tier at the time, but you may not know that just a few years ago, your story, which is much greater and longer than I just summarized, was told in Europe by Sandra Steingraber. So what you did is so unusual and so wonderful that it deserves that kind of publicity. That's why I'm thanking you personally today. Our assignment, or the invitation to our league, was to talk today about the history of voting rights in America and today, and what we can do about the problem. Well, books have been written, and here's 4 that I want you to see and look at in case you want to read one of them or browse in one of them later. I just lost my train of thought. We don't have time to do that much detail today about voting rights. So I have decided to focus on 1955 to 1960, and then jump about 50 years to get more up to modern times, and including up through this year. Let me ask you a question. Who can remember something of national importance that happened in 1955 in America, not about voting rights, but about racial injustice? 1955, does that ring a bell to anybody? Rosa Parks? Yes, you know Rosa Parks, know of her. But before I say a little more about her, I want to backtrack 4 months to August of 1955. That summer, a young boy, really, a teenager, 14 years old, from Chicago, was in Mississippi visiting his relatives. He allegedly did something like flirt with a white woman. He was black. He was abducted, he was assaulted, his face was smashed in, and he vanished. And 3 days later, they found him. His mother did something very, very courageous and brilliant. She left the lid of the coffin open for the world to see back then, the world, not just Mississippi and Chicago. And you can find that picture and face online today and still see the horrific thing that was done to this child. 4 months later, Rosa Parks, a black woman, did not give her, she sat in the front of the bus in Montgomery instead of the back where the black people were supposed to sit. And she did not get up and give her seat to white people. I think it happened on a Thursday. And by Monday, which is only a few days later, Martin Luther King Jr. and others in the area had organized and mobilized hundreds of people to take part in a boycott of the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. The black women who lived, black people lived in one part of town and white people lived elsewhere, but the black women worked for the white families that lived farther away. The point was not to ride the bus, but also to be able to keep your job so you could buy groceries. And those people organized, and all these black women who needed to get to the white suburbs at least 5 days a week, if not 7, walked. They walked for miles, which took hours, in the morning, in the evening, and we're glad to do it. There were some people who had cars and helped transport some of those women. There were some white women who used their car when their husband was at work and came and picked them up and took them where they needed to go because it was the right thing to do. And a little over a year later, started December of 55, and in December of 56, the U.S. Supreme Court, back then, my hearing aid just died, passed a law, or declared, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that segregating buses was unconstitutional. They won. It was long and hard and difficult, and it was winter, but they kept at it. By then, Martin Luther King was very well known and respected. And organizations like SNCC, which stands for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, which stands for Congress of Racial Equality, and others that I don't remember, organized to do nonviolent civil disobedience. In 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected as our president. He and King were on the same path and were thinking the same way, but not in terms of timing. They had conversations, and Kennedy was sympathetic to the terrible things that were going on in this country. But he, at that time, said to King, we can't get a voting rights bill passed now. There were more peaceful protests around the country. There were those lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, South Carolina, and other places in which students went into a drugstore or wherever they sold what we called soda pop, where I grew up, sat on the stools and tried to order a beverage. They were not served, and they were told to leave. And the more they did this and the longer they stayed, the more they got hurt physically by the people brought in to drag them out. Excuse me. In January of '63, a Baptist church in Birmingham was bombed, and 4 precious little black girls died. these big things couldn't be forgotten, and they add up in people's minds and experience. Congress, well, the president, Kennedy, proposed a Civil Rights Act, but it was filibustered in the Senate and went nowhere. But with all this bad stuff going on, the leaders of the nonviolent movement decided to have a march on Washington in August of 1963. And this was 250,000 people gathered, which was rather unheard of at that time for a concern about racial injustice. King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which is on the news every year. And of course it's online. And of all the many profound statements that he says in that speech was the one I remember most, which is, "I have a dream that someday children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Absolutely profound. So here's another high where something really good is happening and everyone can be proud and hope that we will continue to move forward. And 3 months later, Kennedy was assassinated. So Lyndon Johnson becomes president. He's a Southerner, but he was a wise and fair man. And he actually agreed with King and all the other leaders that these things were wrong and needed to be changed. But again, it's too soon to pass a voting bill. That summer, in 1964, I was still in college, and I remember it was called the Freedom Summer. And the Presbyterian minister on our campus was publicizing it to people like me. And I almost went, but I didn't. I wound up going to a camp for children from East Harlem that summer. 17,000 students came from all over the country to register voters in Mississippi. 17,000 voters, mostly black, tried to register with the help of the white students and help of black people too, of course. 1,200, not 17,000, but 1,200 actually succeeded to get registered. But at the beginning of that Freedom Summer, two white students from up north, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, and a black man from Mississippi named James Chaney, disappeared. They were abducted, they were assaulted, they were killed, murdered. And it was at least 3 days before anybody found them. So here we have another terrible tragedy that is publicized nationally. And so in July of that summer, 1964, President Johnson and Congress passed the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It prohibited unequal application of voter registration requirements. And here's a famous example. there was a requirement that in order to vote in Mississippi at that time, you had to pass a literacy test. All of us in this room could have passed it because we would have been handed a piece of paper that had a few sentences in easy grade school English that of course we could read. But if we were black, we would have been handed a different piece of paper, which had very complex, maybe Old English, maybe a foreign language, and of course they couldn't pass. Okay, that was prohibited in the 1964 Voting Rights Amendment, and racial segregation in the schools was prohibited. Well, you can imagine, this is a fantastic, wonderful new law that many of us welcomed, but it was hated by the other side. Peaceful protests continued, and in February of '65, there was a night march, and by march we're talking about walking peacefully. The protesters were met by state troopers, and a youth leader named Jimmy Lee Jackson tried to, when the opposition attacked, Jimmy Lee Jackson tried to protect his mother and his grandfather, who were at the peaceful protest, but he wound up getting shot in the back and killed. So here we have another thing, a wonderful new law passed, and in 6 months this happens. The leaders said it was like the straw that broke the camel's back. We couldn't just keep going on as is. So they planned a 54-mile peaceful walk from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery for that summer. No, for March. They were going to walk that distance to the state capitol and have a rally, peaceful, at the capitol. So on Sunday, March 7th, 1965, hundreds of people met at the Edmund Pettus Bridge to peacefully protest. State troopers were there already, blocking the street, and over a megaphone, one of the leaders, one of the officials, said, "You have to leave. You have 3 minutes to disperse." And hundreds of people knelt down on the pavement and closed their eyes and prayed. And they were told they had 3 minutes to leave. But after 2.5 minutes, the troopers charged with horses, with dogs, with clubs, violently assaulting people, and people like John Lewis, who was in the front row, of course, got a concussion from it. And here's something that I didn't know, or I didn't remember until I was reading for this event today. ABC News, on that day, March 7th, 1965, interrupted their own primetime program for 15 minutes, and they showed live what was going on in Selma. But nobody let that stop them. I mean, the protesters weren't stopped by this horrible tragedy. 3 days later, people like you and me, and a whole lot of clergy, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, and whatever else, flew in from all over the country so they could march with the local black people at Selma across that bridge. They were unharmed. The troopers split and divided, and the march went on. 8 days after what came to be known as Bloody Sunday, when the troopers did attack, President Johnson called a joint meeting of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and urged the passage of a voting rights bill. The special thing about that bill, besides getting rid of things like literacy tests that are unequally administered, was Section 5, which required 6 states and several counties within some other states to have to get federal permission to ever change their voting laws, rules, and regulations. The 6 states were Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Virginia, and South Carolina. This was the most important piece of civil rights legislation ever passed in this country, people say. So here's another really big, wonderful thing, the passage of the Voting Rights Bill of 1965. But sadly, things went downhill from there. And if you want details of not just what I've told you, but what I didn't tell you, this book, Give Us the Ballot, by Ari Berman, whom I heard in Ithaca when he received an award for his independent journalism on this book. You might want to read some of it. Now we're going to fast forward to 2013. The Supreme Court at that time, which is basically composed the way it is today, removed the requirement in Section 5. They canceled, vetoed Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which said people need permission to make changes. Well, it opened Pandora's box. All kinds of new rules and regs were passed by those people in those states, ranging from shortening the hours of polling stations being open, closing polling stations in black neighborhoods, limiting use of absentee ballots, and so on. But by this time, historically, everyone had been through so much, so long, even we white people, not just blacks who were physically experiencing it. An amazing thing happened in Florida. There was a man named Desmond Meade, M-E-A-D-E, who had been homeless, a drug addict, imprisoned for felony charges. And while he was a black man, while he was there, he read law books about law in prison. And by the time he came out, he was ready to go to college, go to law school, and then fight the biggest fight of his life, which is a political one here. The state of Florida did not let people who had served time for a felony charge vote. You serve your time, you get out, and you try to start a new life, and you couldn't even vote. In Florida, people can put a referendum on the ballot, which we cannot in New York, and they wanted to amend, he and the people he organized under FRC, which is Florida Rights Restitution Coalition said we want to amend the Florida state constitution so that people who have served their time and served on parole or been through parole can vote. There were 1.4 million people in that category who had re-entered society but couldn't even vote. He formed this group, and pro bono attorneys, the League of Women Voters of Florida, and I'm sure many other good organizations and individuals joined it and publicized it, the amendment, and went door to door. And 65% of the voters who voted that day said, yes, we must amend our constitution and let free people vote. It was phenomenal. And he wrote this book. This is Desmond Meade's book, Let My People Vote, which is shorter and faster reading than the other one I mentioned, and you might well like to read it. So by now, we, people of Florida, have this great success story, and other people in other states see what's possible. And next door in Georgia, Stacey Abrams started organizing. And she started a group called Fair Fight. Her book is over there. The title is Our Time Is Now. I recommend all these. And when she got people in Georgia informed and educated, and they went door to door across the state, they registered 300,000 new voters. 300,000, just by the people. Okay, now I'm jumping to this year, 2022. Here's the really good news. We, New Yorkers, passed the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Bill of New York. That was in June. Then this fall, in Kansas, the people voted for what they thought was right and what they wanted, ignoring the party leaders of their own party. And on October 4th, which was a few days ago, the article on the far left corner of that table was on the front page of the Ithaca Journal. It's written by the Associated Press, the title of which is Election Workers Brace for Unruly Poll Watchers. That's what's needed in a lot of states in 2 weeks when we have this election. And if you only read the first two little short paragraphs, it tells of a polling station during the primary when a woman who was a poll watcher, which is legal, a major party can allow a person to stand in the polling place and watch. But this woman, this poll watcher, pushed herself between the person who was trying to vote and the machine that he was voting on. I mean, it's bizarre. But things like that happen by people who want their way and their control and nothing else. The article uses the word later, it says, the lady who was ejected from the polling site, that they obviously kicked her out one way or another. Okay, enough from me. The next part of this program is supposed to be, what can we do? And before any of you raise your hand or just speak out like popcorn style to things, mentioning things we can do, I do want to stop and say, do you have any questions or any comments about the history I've just shared? Okay, we'll go on to the biggie. What can we do about this, you and I? As I started thinking of some answers in categories of type of action, like education, legislation, those things that are always possibilities, I got intrigued to see if I could come up with an acronym for the first letter of each of these points. And it was just for fun, it was yesterday. Mm-hmm. I came up with 6 categories that we're all gonna brainstorm on in just a minute. The 4 in the middle are common, like education and legislation, but the first and the 6th are not things you see listed as what we can do. I'll start with the first one. Oh, I came up with an acronym, RESOLVE, but without the E on the end, RESOLV. Because I didn't want to compete with some other organization somewhere that used that name. And not that I'm an organization, but anyway. The first one that starts with the letter R is register voters year-round through organizations like the League of Women Voters, which does this really well several times a year in places around the county. NAACP does it. I'm sure there are other groups that do it, but you and I can do it. How, where, and by what means do you think you could register a voter? What if you knew of a friend that's not registered? What could you do?
Take them down,
I'm sorry?
take them to register, take them
Take them
to where you register.
to where you register? Okay. Sure.
Where is that?
Right.
You can do it online. I mean, that's how I switched my affiliation, so I assume you
Yes.
could have just
Yes, people can
registered.
register online, but if they're already...
If they have Wi-Fi access.
Right, that's true. And if they really want to, but the people who aren't registered now have chosen not to register one way or another. And if you take the, I brought enough of these for everybody to take home one. And if you fold it up, tri-fold, the way its perforations are, this will fit probably in your glove compartment of your car. And you can always have one with you or in your purse. And if the opportunity arises, if the subject comes up, that it would fit for you to bring this up, or if you find a way to turn the conversation with a friend and not insult them by saying, "Are you registered to vote?" But say, if you know anybody in your family or your friends that might not be registered to vote, I'm giving this to you, and you can give it to them or tell them how to do it online. That's easy enough. Can you think of any other ways? Well, we'll move on to my second letter, which is E. Educate yourself, the public, and elected officials. Now, you can wear a mask that says vote on it, like I brought for 2 weeks before the next election. You can get t-shirts that educate voters. This one is really great, and you can study it later, but this is for white people. If you're
Which we
trying to-
happen all to be.
Yes,
in
right.
this audience.
I mean, but I like to wear t-shirts that make anybody and everybody think when they see me in a grocery store, this is in warm weather, or in the parking lot. I mentioned to somebody a minute ago, I have one that says, "We are all immigrants." There's a picture of the Statue of Liberty. We are all immigrants. And these people who want to keep immigrants from coming across the southern border, forget that their relatives were immigrants too. Education, of course, holding a meeting like this, sponsored by this church, is a great way to educate whoever comes. But if you're in a book club or some other organization, you might be able to make an announcement or hand out applications. And I want to show you something that the First Presbyterian Church in Ithaca in 2020, when COVID was just upon us, and when then Governor Cuomo issued an executive order saying that any of us could vote by absentee ballot without the normal required excuses of you're going to be out of town, or you're sick, or you're in the hospital. But most of us weren't used to voting by absentee ballot, and even early voting was new to a lot of us. So as a small committee at First Pres was debating how are we going to help educate people who don't know about these things, we were listing things like get permission to sit outside a grocery store or whatever. And there were two black women who are members of our church who were in that committee meeting, and they said, no. Go where the people are who aren't registered. Like black barbershops and black hairdressers, to name two. So our little committee designed this flyer, Black Lives Matter, so your vote matters too. It tells you what the three options are, and then you pull out this little handout and take it home. And on this little quarter sheet, we got the information, the phone numbers, the email addresses, the dates, the deadlines for all three ways of voting. And it's very low tech, just like my presentation today. But sometimes that works best for some people. You can give gifts to, if you give a gift to a family member or a friend sometime in the course of the year, you can give them books or t-shirts. The calendar here, A History of Racial Injustice, is a fabulous calendar, which is not the kind that you write appointments on. Sally, if you just open to any page and hold it, well, another page, it's got the dates. Every day of the year, there is a piece of history of something that happened on that date of whatever year. It might have been 1843, it might have been 2019. And so there's the history, and here's the pictures. And they put a new one out every year. This is Equal Justice Initiative. I recommend them as gifts. Can you think of any other ways we can educate our friends?
Well, one thing that we haven't been able to do since the pandemic, but we're trying to figure out how we can, is we've had like community dinners where we've opened up our church, and different churches have taken part of it too in feeding people. But that would be, definitely there are people there that are probably more on the, the edges that might not know. That could be ways that at least we could have the information there. for them to get that kind of information.
Excellent.
So, if I can jump in here, your library has information about voting. We distributed it to all the libraries in the county before National Voter Registration Day. And it's been available for people to do all they need to register to vote in the libraries. Now, you could do that. We could provide you with handouts similar to this, similar to this one, with a poster to go with it, to places where you think they're appropriate in Dryden. I don't know all the places in Dryden that would be a good place, but certainly you've got eating establishments and the hotel on the way. You've got places where it would be really good to have this sort of information. And one of the things that I'm going to give you now, before I forget, this is all the information. You have to be registered first, and the last day to register was October the 14th. But this has got all the information that anybody in Tompkins County needs to vote in the election. Every community have different people to vote for. The town of Ithaca, the city of Ithaca are different. Enfield, Newfield, Dryden, Trumansburg, they all have different people to vote for. They're all on this, whether they are Democrat or Working Party or Republican or Conservative. It's all listed on this form. And there are phone numbers. And then the one thing that I think is most valuable is this QR code here. That QR code takes you to Vote 411. And 411 is the League of Women Voters one-stop website for voting information. You plug in your address and it takes you to all you need to know about voting. Your polling place, who's running, any ballot propositions on the back, of your ballot, and there are 2 on the back of the ballot this year. One for everybody, which is the Environmental Bond Act, which is you supported anti-fracking. You should really look at and support. And there's one for the city of Ithaca, who want to change the way they have their mayor. They want to have a city manager. Yes?
Do you ever find obstacles to doing this? I mean, like, say, Wegmans. And you go in and you'd like to post something there. Have you ever had
Well,
places
yes.
where it would be great to have this, but they say, no, we don't do that?
There are lots of places who say, no, we don't do that. And one just,
Like,
I remember a small boy, a scout, when my son was a scout, selling popcorn. And he always won the scout who sold the most popcorn. And his philosophy as life was, I have to get 10 no's before I get 1 yes. So every no was a success. So I try and remember that if somebody says no, that's a success because I've checked them off the list. They go in a different pot to find out why they've said no. Most people say yes if they've got the capability. But if you think of leaving a pile of flyers at Wegmans, they get completely lost.
I'm just bringing.
Yeah, that is. I mean, it's a
I
good
can't
point.
think why anybody or any organization or any place would say no.
Because there's so many organizations they put
The point is, if they say yes to me, they've got to say yes to you and to you, and they don't have the space for 100,000 organizations. That's a very good reason. Also, if you do leave flyers in some places, it's a waste of paper. you need the local gas station where people go, not where they pay at the pump, but where they go inside. And it's on a crossroads, and it's where everybody in a community buys their gas from. That's a great place because you catch a lot of people. You've got your hand up.
Have you considered putting something in the senior centers? Because a lot of them don't travel, and some do not have phones or internet. And how about food pantries?
Yes and yes. I think.
Because I haven't seen anything in my senior center at all.
Well, we're limited by our number of volunteers to take them out. Now, before I leave, I'm going to take your name and your contact information because I will find out how to get the material to you for your senior centre.
No problem.
Okay, so don't let me go without your name and your, whether it's email, text, and
But
that's
this is
another
something
thing.
that I've been trying to get across where I live at a senior center. Trying to get the people to think about what we are really voting for.
Yeah, well, it's, we can certainly, if you will work hard, you can get all of that. Because you can go here, go onto this QR code.
I don't do that.
You don't do that. Well, I am sure your administrator at the senior centre knows how to do that.
Well, she may not do it either. I can go on the internet.
Right.
And can I plug in Vote 411 and get the same info?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Are there any voter rights problems in Tompkins County?
I don't, not directly.
Okay, so we don't need to lead a protest march or anything?
No,
Okay.
however, what we're asking everybody to do, because what goes on in Alabama affects what goes on in New York. If we don't get our legislators to vote the right way, there's no hope of getting other legislators to.
Are there any problems in New York State?
No.
I'm not aware, but in a big city like New York, there could well be long lines and things like that, which are not good and not fair. I don't, do you have a question?
Well, I was just saying, not that this is an inherent problem, but because we're a new district, and I don't know if
Yes.
everybody in this room knows we're a new district, but often people in this county felt like their vote was like, oh my goodness, we're just gonna lose because of where we were lumped with the rest of where I grew up. But anyway, we're not that. It's highly competitive this year. So a vote matters. It's a highly competitive race
Yeah, and-
that's more representative. I mean, I'll just say, I know you're not, I am pretty liberal and I am that way. So I'm excited that maybe we have a chance to bring policies in line with some core values that I have. And
Now-
I don't think everybody knows, it's new.
One of the things that I'm taking my League of Women Voters hat off, I'm embarrassed to say, the Democratic Party gerrymandered over redistricting.
Yeah.
And that's why the first redistricting was sent back.
Yep.
The Democratic Party behaved the same way the Republican, we accused the Republican Party. The League of Women Voters, my hat back on again, signed on to the lawsuit against New York State
Yeah.
to make them do it again and do it properly. And next year, or for the elections in '24, our Assembly District 125, Anna Kelly's, her seat, will be redistricted because they were too late in getting the lawsuit in. There was some gerrymandering there as well.
Yeah.
And so anytime you have an opportunity to lobby a legislator, any party persuasion, you should be expressing your concern about things like gerrymandering, like voting rights, like the Equal Rights Amendment. the Equal Rights Amendment has still not been adopted. We need to lobby our senators about that. We can, if you go to the League of Women Voters website, either our website, and that will jump you into the state and then to the national websites, you can get information about how to contact your senators to lobby them.
I emailed one of our representatives requesting some info on how do you feel? Never got an answer back, not even a generic answer. Got ignored completely.
I can't comment on that. I don't know. I do know that the larger the number of people they represent, the more difficult it is for you to get a personal answer. What you need to
Never
do.
got even a generic reply.
Yeah, well, I know if we go down to the smallest district here for national politics, we go to Anna Kelly's. She has an office in both Cortland and in Ithaca. And if you go to either Cortland or Ithaca, the office, and contact them, they will give you an answer. Now, for our other representatives, I don't know. I also hear people complaining that they write to the mayor of Ithaca and that they don't get a reply from the mayor of Ithaca. I think it's a problem for all of us. It's a problem for us as constituents. It's a problem for the legislators in their job. Communicating is really difficult. And we as the voters have just got to keep at it. There are so many means now. I mean, if you go to kids at school and ask them how they communicate, they come up with words that you've never heard before. My grandchildren use different methods, and they have to teach me how to communicate with them. Kids don't use email anymore. Some of them still use text messages. So I can communicate with some kids. Well, now, if you go into other communities, I know the African American communities, they tend to use different social media too, the way they communicate. And I think what we all need to do is to reach out as far as we can to those communities. If we know somebody in those communities, we can start talking to them to say, how can we reach out to you and talk to you about voting? When I was registering voters last month, the number of people who said, I'm not going to vote, there's no point. The system's broken and voting doesn't help. It's a surprisingly large group of people that we need to meet and find out what they want. Not voting doesn't help, but certainly if there's nobody who represents them, voting doesn't help either. So.
Can I say something about
Yes,
one vote?
yeah.
It is very common for people to say one vote doesn't make a difference. I'll tell you a true story. I won't mention the name of the person or the state or the office, but someone living in another state in a very small town, and he was a teacher. And while he lived there, 2 of his students got killed in, violence. There is gun violence, even if both people are white or both people are black. It's not always related to race. And he was so horrified that he decided to try to do something about it. And he talked to people, informally to figure out what to do. And had some success in getting people interested. He ran for mayor in this little tiny town, village maybe, and he won by one vote. He became mayor, he continued what I just described, and for a 5-year period, there was not one death to gun violence in his town because of what he and the people were doing. He went on to become a lieutenant governor. He is now running for the US Senate, and I hope he wins. Real quickly, the third, what can we do category after register voters, educate, the S for resolve stands for support state and federal legislation. I'll mention one bill, and I have a handout with these things in them for you. HR 1, that's House of Representatives Resolution number 1, which was introduced at the beginning of this 2-year congressional term, which will end this January. It's HR 1 for the People Act of 2021. That's the bill we need to push really hard until January 3rd, when everything changes. The bills have to be reintroduced, they may have a new name, they'll have a new number, they may have the same or different sponsors. Okay, oppose illegalities by supporting lawsuits against them. ACLU files lawsuits frequently, NAACP does. I think the League of Women Voters does, but I can't give you an example, state or federal, but they're heavily involved at the legislative level, and maybe, do you know?
Well, I can't come up with one offhand, but.
Okay, but this is suing the other side. My next letter is L. Leave no good candidate behind. And that means we as ordinary citizens, the day after this election, can begin to think, who do I know that would be a good candidate to run for school board, village or town governing body, county? And if you're paying much attention to out-of-state races this year, I have never seen so many people running for office out of the blue because they want change and they don't like what's going on or what's not being done. Next letter is V, R-E-S-O-L-V. And I'm back to voting again, but this one says vote. You know, just because you registered in item number 1, you still gotta go vote and help other people go to the polls to vote. I have a friend in Ithaca who has a motorhome, and he has driven out of state to places where there was a race he wanted to help them win. He was in Virginia for 2 weeks in 2008. It doesn't matter where he did it, but he arranges with the party office of the party he's in and says, I can come, I can bring my own lodging and food, how can I help your campaign? And they tell him, and he goes door to door, or he drives people here and there, whatever. You and I could do this with a camper that sleeps 2 people. I mean, he goes down there for 2 weeks. You could do it in a smaller vehicle and again bring lodging and food to do the same thing that way. Or we who live in New York State could make a day's outing to Pennsylvania, to Ohio, to Vermont or Massachusetts, and do the same thing for 8 hours and come home. It takes bodies to make phone calls, to knock on doors and all, and we can do it outside where we live. That's all, except for my closing comment.
Can I just
Oh,
jump
yeah.
in there? And one other thing you can do, and you can certainly do that through your senior citizen centre, is you can help drive people, your friends, to the polls. Yes,
I'm an inspector.
you're an inspector.
Sir,
Well, you can encourage one of your friends to help your friends go
I
to the poll.
encourage them to vote one way or another.
And,
But I've been inspector for years, so
okay, well,
I'm tied up.
so there is still time to get an absentee ballot. So if any of your friends at your senior centre are unable to get to the polls, they can get an absentee ballot. And you could help them do that even if you are an inspector.
I put down every morning, I go down, today is whatever day, and on election day, I put down, be sure to vote in big letters.
Okay.
And you know, the other thing, I think you should call their organization, if you have like representation that doesn't get back to you, you let like the League of Women Voters know, because they'll get on candidates and say, you know, you have constituents that don't hear back from you. I mean, and that's the kind of stuff that if it's publicized, people change the way they do stuff.
Okay, okay, all right, good. Last comment from me. Well, Sally just reminded me to say, all these things up here you can take home. And I just put a pile of white and black, you know, typed sheet of paper with the names of these books and these articles and the dates and the bill that's before Congress right now. You can take them home. I started with your story of Dryden banning fracking in 2014 and reminded all of us that it takes time, money, energy, organization, and courage, and never giving up. And you're an inspiration to all of us. But I want to remind all of us that times have changed, even since 14. I have never seen this country this polarized ever in my lifetime. I'm sure it was in the days of slavery, but when we fight for voting rights today in Dryden or Ithaca or New York State, we're not just fighting for voting rights. We're fighting to save democracy.